The chains bit into Borgek Ironblood's wrists hard enough to draw blood, but she did not cry out. She had not cried out in 3 weeks of captivity, and she was not about to start now, not with half of Blackshell Cove's rot-toothed buyers leering up at her from the torchlit hollow beneath the sea cliffs. "Fine stock," the auctioneer bellowed, prodding her shoulder with a short whip he had not yet dared to use on her. Orc-blooded, strong back, still got her fighting teeth in. Bidding starts at 40 silver. Salt spray hissed against the torches wedged into the cave walls above the tide line, and somewhere beyond the press of bodies, the sea itself seemed to growl in disapproval. Borgak kept her chin high, and her green eyes fixed on a point past all of them, refusing to let a single one of these grubby little men see how badly she wanted to break the manacles and start breaking necks instead. She had counted 11 guards. She could take perhaps 4 before the rest brought her down. It was not enough, and she hated that it was not enough, hated it with the particular fury of a warrior who had never once in her life had to do arithmetic on how many men she could kill before dying. A buyer near the front gret, they called him, a mine broker from the eastern hills with hands like shovels and breath like a tannery raised his fist. 50. That was when the first knife came out of the dark. It did not strike flesh. It struck rope, the thick hawser that held the block's support beam, and the block lurched sideways just as a wall of watchmen in the blue coats of the Coastal Guard came pouring down the cave's rear passage with lanterns blazing and short swords drawn. Someone screamed, the watch has come." And the cove dissolved into chaos, buyers scattering for the tunnels, guards for hire diving for the surf, torches guttering and smoking in the confusion. Borgek barely had time to register any of it before a man dropped down beside her from the ledge above. Not a soldier, not armored, just a lean, sun-browned figure in a traveler's coat with herb satchels slung crosswise over his chest, moving with the quiet economy of someone who had learned long ago that panic wasted breath. He had a curved little blade in his hand, the kind meant for cutting roots and bandages, not throats, and he used it now on the leather strap binding her wrist manacles to the post. "Hold still," he said, as though she were a spooked horse and not an orc twice his weight who could have snapped his neck between 2 fingers. "This is going to pinch." "I do not pinch," Borgek said through her teeth, and then the strap gave way and her arm was free, and she used it immediately to backhand a guard who had been reaching for her from behind, sending him sprawling into a stack of crates. The man, she would learn his name a heartbeat later, when the watch captain shouted it across the cove, worked fast on the second manacle, fingers steady despite the mayhem breaking loose around them, boots scraping on wet stone, torchlight flickering gold and orange across a face that was not handsome in any way the bards would sing about, but was calm and careful and entirely unafraid of her. "Jeremiah Stone, stand down and let the watch do their work." The captain bellowed from across the hollow, hauling a struggling Casimir Vale by the collar of his fine merchant's coat. "I'm helping the watch do their work, Captain Ashby," the man called back, not even looking up from the second strap. "Unless you'd rather explain to the magistrate why you let a chained woman drown when the tide comes in." The second manacle fell away. Borgak rolled her freed wrist, felt the blood rush back into her fingers with a sting like nettles, and looked down at the human who had just cut her loose from a slaver's block with a root knife no longer than his hand. He looked back up at her, unbothered by the 2 feet of height and easily 80 pounds she had on him, and offered the smallest, driest smile she had ever seen on a human face. "You're welcome," he said. "Try not to hit anyone else. Some of them might actually be the good guys." It took the better part of an hour for the cove to settle. The watch dragged out 6 of Vale's hired blades and irons, extinguished half the torches to keep the smoke from choking the tunnels, and herded the freed captives. There were 9 besides Borgak, mostly indentured dockhands and 2 frightened halfling children up into the saltgrass hollow above the tide caves, where the night air was clean and cold and full of stars. Casimir Vale knelt in that hollow now, wrists bound. his fine coat torn at the shoulder, sweat beading on a face gone the color of old cheese as Captain Roderick Ashby read the charges against him from a soaked and smudged warrant. Illegal trade in bonded orc-blooded persons under the Salt Marsh Compact, smuggling of contraband, bribery of a coastal officer. That's hanging weight, Vale, Ashby said, folding the warrant with the grim satisfaction of a man who had chased this particular smuggler for 2 years. Unless you've got something worth trading for a lighter rope. Vale's eyes darted, found Borgak standing at the edge of the firelight with her freed wrists crossed over her chest, and something calculating slid into his fear. The Cove custom, he said quickly. The old restitution law, any wrongly sold captive may name a price from the seller's confiscated goods, sworn before a watch officer, and it stands as partial recompense before the magistrate. It's in the old charter, Ashby, you know it is. Let her name a price. Let the record show I made it right before judgment. It might be the difference between a rope and a rowing bench. Ashby's jaw worked. He did not like it. Borgak could see that plainly, the way a man's mouth thinned when he was being maneuvered by a snake he already had by the tail. But the law was the law, and there were witnesses enough now, freed captives and watchmen both, that he could not simply ignore the charter without inviting complaint from the magistrate later. It's your right if you want it, Ashby said to Borgak, not unkindly. Gold from his strongbox, passage on a ship out of the cove. Even his horse, if you've a mind to walk him home barefoot. Name it and it's done, and it goes easier for all of us come the hearing. Vale straightened where he knelt, some of his oily confidence creeping back now that he thought he saw the shape of his own salvation, a gesture of contrition, a show of mercy purchased cheap. Name your price, he said to Borgak, and there was something greasy in the way he said it, a merchant's habit of turning even his own ruin into a transaction he might still profit from. Whatever you ask within reason. Gold, gems, a ship's berth to wherever you please. Name your price, orc girl, and let it be done. The whole hollow went quiet. Freed dock hands, watchmen with lanterns raised, the 2 halfling children peering out from behind a soldier's legs, all of them waiting to see what a woman who had spent 3 weeks in chains would demand from the man who had put her there. Borgak Ironblood did not look at the strongbox sitting open and glinting in the firelight. She did not look at the ships rocking at anchor beyond the cove mouth, dark shapes against a darker sea, any one of which could have carried her far from every human who had ever wronged her kind. She looked instead at the lean, quiet man standing a little apart from the rest, still holding his small curved knife loosely at his side, watching the proceedings with the faint, tired patience of someone who mostly just wanted to go back to whatever he'd been doing before the world interrupted him. She lifted her arm and pointed. Him, she said. I name him. For a moment nobody moved. Then Vale actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark. I don't own him, woman. I can't give you. You misunderstand, Borgak said, and her voice carried across the hollow with the flat certainty of someone reciting a law far older than any Salt Marsh charter. Among my people there is a debt older than gold. He cut my chains. His hands freed me when he owed me nothing and risked his own neck for it. That is a life debt, and life debts are not paid in silver. She turned, finally, to look directly at Jeremiah Stone, and something in her green eyes made the herbalist go very still. I do not ask you to give me to him, merchant. I tell you what is already true. Whatever price you owe for what you did to me, let it go to him instead, coin for his road, supplies for his healing satchels, whatever a man like that needs and never has enough of. That is my price. Not for myself, for him. Jeremiah Stone opened his mouth, closed it again, and looked, for the first time since Borgak had laid eyes on him, thoroughly out of his depth. I don't need, he started. You freed a stranger with a root knife while 11 armed men watched, Borgak said, cutting him off without raising her voice. And you are going to stand there and tell me you don't need new bandages and a warm coat for winter. I have seen your boots, Jeremiah Stone. They have seen better decades. A ripple of laughter went through the watchman, and even Captain Ashby's mouth twitched despite himself. Vale, sweating, saw no way out of the bargain that would not look worse before the magistrate than simply paying it, and so he nodded jerkily, and one of his own confiscated purses was counted out into Jeremiah's protesting hands along with a bundle of good wool and a small case of surgical tools that had likely been stolen from some honest healer to begin with. "And the woman?" Ashby asked, when the restitution was done and Vale was being hauled back to his feet for the walk to the cells. "What of her? She's no bondservant now, Stone. She's free. What's she meant to do, walk off into the dark?" Borgek answered before Jeremiah could. "I go where the debt takes me," she said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Until it is paid." Jeremiah Stone looked up at her way up. She was a full head taller even without her boots, and something in his tired, weathered face softened into wry resignation, the look of a man who had just realized his quiet, solitary life had ended sometime in the last hour and there was no getting it back. "I suppose you'd better tell me your name, then," he said. "Since we're apparently traveling companions." "Borgek," she said, "Borgek Ironblood, Jeremiah Stone." He held out his hand, the same hand that had held the knife, and after a moment's consideration orcs did not, as a rule, shake hands with humans. It was not a custom that had ever done her people any good. She took it anyway. His grip was steady, careful of her strength, and warmer than she expected. "Try to keep up, Jeremiah Stone," she said. "I do not walk slowly." "Noted," he said, and picked up his satchels, and did not once look at her the way the buyers in the cove had looked at her, like meat or muscle or a problem to be solved. He looked at her like a person. It was, Borgek thought as they climbed the cliff path away from Blackshell Cove under a sky scrubbed clean with stars, the first time a human had done that in longer than she cared to remember. They did not speak much that first night, walking the cliff road inland with the sea grumbling below them, and the freed dock hands and halfling children trailing behind under watch escort toward the nearest proper town. Borgek had expected Jeremiah to be full of questions humans usually were about her tusks, her strength, whether she'd killed men in the old wars, whether the stories were true. But he asked her nothing beyond whether her wrists pained her, and whether she preferred her water boiled or plain. "You are strange for a human," she told him finally, when they made camp in the lee of a wind-bent pine a few miles up the coast road. "I get that a lot," Jeremiah said, coaxing a small fire to life with the ease of long practice. "Mostly from other humans. Why do you not ask me things?" He glanced up at her, firelight catching the lines at the corners of his eyes. Not an old man, but not a young one either, somewhere in his middle 30s, with the sort of weathered patience that came from years of solitary roads. "Would you want to be asked things if you were you?" Borgek considered this. "No. There you go, then." He unrolled a thin blanket and offered it to her without ceremony, as though it did not occur to him that giving his only spare blanket to an orc twice his size might be seen as strange. "You'll want that more than me. I run warm." "I do not need your blanket, Erbman. Didn't say you needed it, said you'll want it." He settled back against his pack, arms folded, eyes already drifting shut with the unhurried confidence of a man who trusted the night would not kill him. "Take it or don't. Makes no difference to me." She took it. She would not have admitted, then or for some time after, how strange and unfamiliar it felt to be given something by a human with no price attached, no debt implied beyond the one she herself had named. She sat with the blanket around her shoulders and watched him sleep across the low fire, this unremarkable man who had cut her chains without being asked and then argued badly against being repaid for it, and something in her chest that had gone hard and watchful in the Slaver's Cove began, very slowly, to loosen. The debt, she told herself. She was only staying for the debt. She did not entirely believe herself, even then. They fell into a rhythm over the following weeks that surprised them both. Jeremiah Stone, it turned out, was no ordinary wandering herbalist but something closer to a physician without a license to practice in any proper town, a healer, who moved from farmstead to fishing village along the ragged northern coast, treating fevers and broken bones and birthing complications for whatever coin, food, or goodwill folk could spare, sleeping in barns and hedgerows more often than beds. He had gentle hands, Borgak noticed, the kind that moved with total confidence around wounds and root poultices, but fumbled, endearingly, whenever she caught him looking at her a moment too long, and he pretended suddenly to be very interested in his own boots. He had a dry wit that took her some time to understand was not, in fact, mockery. The first time he told her, deadpan, that she snored like a foundering ship. She had nearly broken his jaw before realizing from the twitch at the corner of his mouth that he was teasing her, and that teasing, among humans, was apparently sometimes a form of affection. She had laughed then, a short, startled bark of a laugh, and he had looked so absurdly pleased with himself that she'd had to fight the urge to smile again for an hour afterward. "You are ridiculous," she told him. "I've been told," he agreed. For her part, she made herself useful in ways that had nothing to do with any debt, and everything to do with the fact that watching him work eased something restless in her. She hauled his heavier packs without being asked, stood guard at the edges of villages that eyed a lone orc woman with open suspicion, and more than once put her body between Jeremiah and men who thought a wandering healer was an easy target for a beating and a stolen purse. The first time it happened, 3 drunk fishermen outside a coastal tavern, deciding Jeremiah's coin looked easier to take than Ernchi simply stepped in front of him, folded her arms, and said nothing at all. The fishermen took one look at the breadth of her shoulders, the tusks, the flat green stare, and found urgent business elsewhere. "You didn't have to do that," Jeremiah said afterward, though he did not sound like he minded. "You did not have to cut my chains," Borgak said. "We are even less than before. I am adding to the debt now, not paying it. That's not how debts work. It is how mine works." He'd laughed at that, properly laughed, head tipped back, and she had felt something in her chest turn over slow and warm, like a stone rolling loose after being wedged too long in cold water. The retrieval of her own leathers happened on the 4th day, when they passed back near enough to a coastal guard depot that Jeremiah insisted on stopping to collect the confiscated goods listed under Vale's seized inventory, not for himself, but because he had noticed quietly that Borgak still wore the rough sacking shift the slavers had put her in, and had said nothing about it, not wanting to seem as though she cared. He had cared enough to ask on her behalf. A watch clerk, grumbling, dug out a trunk of confiscated captive belongings, and there among the sad collection of stolen rings and cheap trinkets was Borgak's own gear. A fitted leather bodice, dark green-brown and worn soft with years of wear, laced snug up the front and reinforced with a single steel-studded pauldron over the left shoulder. Close-fitted leggings meant for hard riding and harder fighting, tucked into knee-high boots. A wide belt with 2 empty sheaths where knives had once hung. She changed behind a windbreak of gorse while Jeremiah pointedly studied the horizon, and when she stepped back out, dressed again as herself, as a warrior, not a captive, she felt something in her spine straighten that had been bowed since the cove. "Better?" Jeremiah asked, still not quite looking at her directly. "Better," she agreed, and caught him glancing anyway, quick and helpless, at the way the leather fit her, before he cleared his throat and busied himself with retying a pack strap that did not need retying. She filed that glance away to think about later in the dark, when she could not sleep for reasons that had nothing to do with the hard ground. It was on the coast road north of the fishing town of Greywater that they first heard whispers of the sickness-a-wasting fog, folk called it, that crept in off the sea some nights and left whole households too weak to rise from bed by morning, skin gone gray and clammy, breath rattling like dry reeds. Jeremiah's face had gone tight and thoughtful at the first mention of it, and Borgak noticed the way his hand drifted, unconsciously, to press against his own left forearm, where his sleeve was always buttoned close even in warm weather. "You know this sickness," she said. "It was not a question." "I've seen it before," he said carefully. "A long time ago. I hoped I never would again." He said nothing more about it then, and Borgak, who understood better than most the weight of things a person was not yet ready to speak of, did not push. But she noticed. She noticed the shadow that crossed his face whenever Greywater and its sickness came up in the talk of other travelers on the road. And she noticed, too, the careful way he kept that forearm covered, sleeve buttoned even as autumn gave way to the first bite of true cold, and the coast road climbed higher into wind-swept, treeless country where the sea cliffs gave way to bare granite headlands. They were 3 days out from the nearest shelter, crossing the high spine of the Kestrel Downs where the road cut close along the cliff edge before dropping toward the next valley, when the sky turned the color of a bruise and the wind began to scream. "That's not a storm," Jeremiah said, squinting up at the roiling dark. "That's a wall." He was right. Within the hour, snow was coming sideways off the sea in stinging sheets, visibility dropping to arm's length, the temperature plunging so fast Borgak felt it in her teeth. This was no gentle autumn squall. This was the first true blizzard of the northern winter, arriving early and vicious, and the coast road offered no shelter at all beyond bare rock and gorse too stunted to break the wind. "There," Jeremiah shouted over the howl, pointing with a mittened hand toward a dark seam in the cliff face below the road, a slot barely visible through the whiteout. "See cave. I've sheltered in one like it before. This whole coast is riddled with them. Can you climb down in this? Can you?" Borgak shot back, but she was already moving, catching his pack strap in one fist to steady him as they picked their way down the icy scree toward the cave mouth, the wind trying to peel them both off the rock face and hurl them into the churning gray sea below. Twice Jeremiah's boots skidded on ice-slick stone, and twice her hand shot out and caught him, hauling him back against her chest with a strength that should have terrified a human, and instead seemed only to make him laugh, breathless and half-frozen. "Remind me to thank you properly once we're not about to die," he shouted. "Stop nearly dying and I will consider it even." They reached the cave as full dark fell, more by feel than sight, ducking into a narrow throat of rock that widened blessedly, into a dry chamber deep enough that the wind's worst fury broke against the outer walls and left the inner space merely bitterly cold rather than lethal. Jeremiah's hands, when he tried to strike flint to the small store of tinder he carried, were shaking too badly from cold to manage it. "Let me," Borgak said, and took the flint from him, her own hand steadier though not by much. It took 6 tries before a spark caught, and when the small fire finally guttered to life, throwing shaky orange light against the wet cave walls, Jeremiah sagged with a relief so total it was almost comical. "I take back every unkind thing I've ever thought about sea caves," he said. They were both soaked through, and the storm outside showed no sign of easing. If anything, it grew worse as the night deepened, the wind screaming across the cave mouth like something wounded. Jeremiah, teeth chattering, began methodically stripping off his sodden coat and outer shirt with the clinical detachment of a healer assessing a patient, laying them near the fire to dry, and Borgak understood the shape of the problem even before he said it aloud. "We need to get warm," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "properly warm, or we're both going to be in serious trouble by morning. I've seen men die of the cold in shelter no worse than this, when they let their wet clothes freeze them from the inside. You are suggesting we share warmth." "I'm suggesting we don't die of stubbornness," Jeremiah said. "I'll turn my back if you'd rather manage alone, but 2 bodies share heat better than one, and I've got no interest in explaining to whatever God watches over healers why I let you freeze to prove a point about propriety." Borgak studied him for a long moment across the small fire, this strange, stubborn, gentle man who had cut her chains and refused payment, and given her his only blanket and now sat shivering rather than presume anything of her, and felt something in her chest crack open like ice on a spring river. "Come here, Jeremiah Stone," she said, "before you catch your death being noble." They arranged the dry blanket and their combined coats into a rough nest close by the fire, and Borgak pulled him against her without further ceremony, her larger frame wrapping around his, with the easy, practical strength of someone who had spent a lifetime handling weapons and armor twice her own weight. For a while neither of them spoke, listening to the storm howl and gutter and howl again beyond the cave mouth, sharing warmth in the flickering dark, and Borgek was intensely, achingly aware of every point where his body pressed against hers. The solid human warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart she could feel through his back, the way his breathing slowly evened out from fright, chattering gasps into something calmer. "Borgek," he said after a long while, his voice low and rough in the dark. "Thank you for staying. I know it wasn't really about the debt, not for a while now." She was quiet a moment, turning the words over. Outside, the wind screamed and the sea threw itself against the cliffs far below, and inside this small pocket of borrowed warmth she found herself saying something she had not planned to say. Not yet, not so soon, but the storm seemed to have stripped away her usual caution along with the last of the cold. "No," she agreed. "It stopped being about the debt somewhere on the road to Greywater. I do not know exactly when." She felt him go very still against her. "You are the first human who has ever looked at me and seen a person before a weapon or a prize or a problem. I did not know how much I wanted that until you gave it to me without being asked." Jeremiah turned in her arms then, slow and careful, until he was facing her in the firelight, close enough that she could see every line of exhaustion and hope warring in his face. "I've been trying very hard not to want things I have no business wanting," he admitted. "You're a warrior of a proud people who could have anyone. I'm a broke herbalist who sleeps in barns." "I did not choose you for your gold, Jeremiah Stone," Borgek said, and there was something fierce in it now, something that had been building since the moment she pointed at him in that torchlit cove and said "I name him." "I chose you because you freed a stranger with nothing to gain and everything to lose, and because you have not once looked at me like I owe you something for it. I have killed men for less insult than what Vale intended for me, and buried kin for less kindness than what you have given me without thinking twice. Do not tell me what I have no business wanting. I am an orc. I know exactly what I want." Whatever restraint either of them had been holding onto broke then, all at once, like the storm itself had reached inside the cave and swept it away. It was Jeremiah who closed the last distance between them, or perhaps it was Borgek who pulled him in. Neither of them could quite say who moved first. But the kiss that followed was neither gentle nor uncertain, weeks of banked longing finding release in the firelit dark while the storm raged unheeded outside. His hands, gentle hands that had set bones and stitched wounds and coaxed fevers down with cool cloths, moved over her with a reverence that made her ache in ways she had no name for. Her own hands, strong enough to break a man's arm without effort, learned instead the terrifying, thrilling discipline of tenderness. What passed between them in that sea cave through the long howling night was not spoken of afterward in detail, not even between themselves, but it changed something fundamental and irreversible in the shape of what they were to each other. When dawn came gray and exhausted over a storm finally spent, they woke tangled together beneath the shared blanket, and Borgek watched Jeremiah's sleeping face for a long moment before he stirred, and thought, with a clarity that startled her, "I am not leaving this man. Whatever comes, I am not leaving." He woke to find her watching him and did not look away, did not fumble for words or apologize for a night neither of them regretted. He simply reached up and brushed his thumb along the curve of one tusk, the way another man might trace a lover's jaw, and said, "Good morning, Borgek Ironblood," as though it were the most natural thing in the world, and she found to her own faint surprise that it was. It was 2 days after the storm, once they'd climbed back up to the coast road and found their bearings, that Jeremiah finally spoke of the brand. They had stopped to rest at a lonely shepherd's cairn, and he had rolled his sleeve to tend a cut he'd taken scrambling down the storm-slick rocks, and Borgek saw it plainly for the first time in daylight, a puckered, ugly scar on the inside of his left forearm, the unmistakable shape of a magistrate's iron. A broken circle crossed through, the old mark for asterisk oathbreaker, branded into flesh by law rather than accident. 10 years ago, Jeremiah said, before she could ask, his voice carefully flat in the way of a man reciting an old wound so it would not hurt fresh again. I was apprenticed to a healer named Marin, up near the border keeps, during the last flare of the border wars. There was a ceasefire 3 days only to collect the wounded from both sides. I treated men on both sides of that line, Borgek. Orc wounded too, dying in the mud same as ours. Marin taught me it wasn't my place to ask a dying man's blood before I stopped his bleeding. His jaw tightened. The garrison commander called it treason, aiding the enemy under truce. He had no proof I'd done more than my duty as a healer, so he couldn't hang me, but he could brand me an oath-breaker and cast me out, make sure no town within 100 miles would let me practice openly again. Marin protested. They branded her too for teaching me. She died the following winter in a ditch because no one would take in a branded woman even to let her freeze somewhere warmer. Borgek said nothing for a long moment, absorbing this. This is why you wander, why you never stay in one town long. Word travels slower on the road than it does in a settled practice. I keep my sleeve buttoned, I do good quiet work, I move on before anyone looks too closely. He managed a thin, tired smile. It's not much of a life, I know. It is the life of a man who chose mercy over safety when it cost him everything, Borgek said, and there was iron in her voice now, orc iron, the kind that did not bend. My people understand branding, Jeremiah. We understand what it costs to be marked as other, as less, for showing kindness across a line drawn by men who never had to bleed on it themselves. You are not oath-broken. You kept the only oath that ever mattered, the one a healer makes to the wound, not the war. Jeremiah looked at her for a long moment, something raw and grateful moving behind his eyes, and did not trust himself to speak. She reached over and covered the brand with her own broad palm, gentle despite her strength, as though she could shield the old scar from the memory of the iron that made it. I know why this matters now, Borgek said slowly. Greywater, the wasting sickness. You have seen it before. During the ceasefire, Jeremiah confirmed, quiet. It swept the border camps that same winter, human and orc alike. Marin found the cure before she died. A sea herb, grows only in tide caves along the northern coast, has to be harvested at the lowest ebb of a winter moon or it loses its potency. It's not written in any healer's book that any lord would let stand in a library. Orc healers knew it long before we did. Marin learned it from an orc woman she treated, traded knowledge for knowledge, the way it should always be done and almost never is. He looked out toward the gray northern horizon, where smoke from Greywater's chimneys was just visible in the distance. If that sickness has come back, I'm likely the only living person on this coast who remembers how the cure is made. And using it, openly, in front of a town's watch, means showing my face and my methods to exactly the kind of men who branded me the first time. Then we will not let them brand you a second time, Borgek said, with the flat, immovable certainty of a woman who had already decided the shape of the fight ahead and simply hadn't informed the rest of the world yet. Greywater, when they reached it 2 days later, was a town in the grip of quiet terror. Shutters were closed against the sea wind and something else besides. A bell tolled slow and mournful from the small stone chapel near the harbor, marking another death. And the market square, usually bustling even in the cold months with fishmongers and wool traders, stood half empty, its remaining stalls tended by hollow-eyed folk who flinched at every cough. Captain Roderick Ashby, it turned out, had been reassigned north to Greywater in the weeks since Blackshell Cove, overseeing the coastal watch's response to what the town elders were now openly calling a plague. He recognized Jeremiah at once when they presented themselves at the watch house, and something like desperate hope flickered across his tired face. "Stone," he said, "the herbalist from the cove, tell me you know something useful, because I've buried 11 souls this fortnight and my own physicians out of ideas past bleeding folk, which only makes them weaker." "I might," Jeremiah said carefully. "I'll need access to the sea caves below the western headland, and I'll need it at low tide tonight, before the moon turns." Ashby did not ask why a wandering herbalist would know such a specific thing. He was too desperate for hope to question its source, and he gave Jeremiah leave to work, posting no guard against him at all, not yet. The harvest itself became its own small ordeal, another set piece carved sharp against the darkening winter sky. Jeremiah and Borgek picking their way down slick black rocks below the headland, as the tide reached its lowest ebb under a bruised violet twilight, searching the dripping mouths of half-flooded caves for the pale, star-shaped fronds of the sea herb clinging to the wet stone just above the water line. The current still ran dangerous even at low ebb, sucking and surging around the cave mouths, and it was Borgek's orc strength and steady balance on the treacherous rock that let Jeremiah reach the deepest, richest patches of herb without being swept away, her hand locked around his wrist, anchoring him as he leaned out over black water to strip the fronds free, the two of them working in a rhythm that had become, over these past weeks, almost wordless. Once, a sudden surge caught Jeremiah's footing and swept his legs from under him, and it was Borgek who hauled him bodily back from the water's edge with one arm, hoisting him against her chest as easily as she might a child, both of them soaked and laughing breathlessly with the particular giddy relief of two people who had once again nearly died together and found, somehow, that they didn't much mind the company. "We should stop nearly dying together," Jeremiah said, water streaming from his hair. "It's becoming a habit." "It is becoming our habit," Borgek corrected, and kissed the cold water from his mouth right there on the rocks, heedless of anything but him. They returned to Greywater before dawn with enough sea herb, crushed and prepared according to Marin's old method that Jeremiah had carried in memory for a decade, to treat the town's worst afflicted. He worked through the following day in the common room of the town's largest inn, converted hastily into a sick room, moving from pallet to pallet with his gentle hands and his careful, patient voice, coaxing the bitter green medicine down throats too weak to protest, checking pulses, murmuring reassurance to frightened children and their frightened parents alike. Borgek stood at the door throughout, not because anyone had asked her to guard it, but because it did not occur to her to be anywhere else. It was on the second day of treatment, as the first patients began to show real improvement, color returning to gray cheeks, fever breaking, breath coming easier, that disaster found them anyway. Jeremiah had rolled his sleeves against the heat of the sick room, forgetting, for the first time in 10 careful years, to keep the old brand covered. A merchant's wife recovering on a nearby pallet saw it first and gasped and pointed, and the word spread through the crowded inn like fire through dry grass. "Oathbreaker," someone hissed. "He's a branded man." Branded traitor. By the time Captain Ashby arrived, summoned by the growing murmur of alarm, half the town square outside had gathered, drawn by rumor and fear in equal measure, and the mood had curdled fast from desperate hope into something uglier, the particular ancient human fear of being tricked, of having trusted a marked man with their children's lives. "Is it true?" Ashby demanded, standing in the inn doorway with the whole square watching, his hand not quite on his sword hilt but close enough that everyone noticed. "Are you a branded oathbreaker, Stone?" Jeremiah did not flinch, did not try to hide the mark now that it was seen. He stood in the doorway of the sick room, sleeves still rolled, the old scar plain in the winter light, and said simply, "Yes." The square erupted shouts of "traitor and he's poisoning them," and sees him rising in an ugly chorus, townsfolk who an hour ago had been praying for a healer's help now surging forward with the particular cruelty of frightened people looking for someone to blame. A guard stepped forward to lay hands on Jeremiah's arm. Borgek moved before conscious thought caught up with her body. She was between Jeremiah and the crowd in an instant, one hand closing hard around the reaching guard's wrist and turning it aside without breaking it. A warning, not a maiming, while her other arm swept back to put Jeremiah bodily behind her, her whole frame filling the doorway like a wall of green-brown leather and old iron. "The next hand that reaches for him loses more than a wrist," she said, and her voice carried across the whole square, flat and absolutely certain. This man has spent 2 days pulling your children back from death with his own 2 hands, while you stood outside wringing yours. If you want to call that treason, you will have to go through me to collect your traitor, and I promise you that is a very poor trade. She's an orc, someone shouted from the crowd. Of course she'd defend a traitor, they're probably in league. I am the reason this cure exists at all, Jeremiah said, his voice cutting through the noise from behind Borgek's shoulder, steady despite everything. 10 years ago, I treated wounded men on both sides of a ceasefire line, because a dying man's blood doesn't ask permission before it spills. I was branded for it because a garrison commander needed someone to punish, and I was convenient. The healer who taught me the cure you're all currently swallowing to save your lives learned it from an orc woman during that same truce. If you want to hang the man responsible for the medicine working in your children's veins right now, go ahead. But you'll do it having killed the last person alive who remembers how to make it, and the next time this sickness comes, because it will come again, it always has, there will be no one left who knows how to stop it. The square went quiet. Ashby stood frozen in the doorway, torn visibly between duty and desperation, his hand still hovering near his sword. It was a woman near the front of the crowd, one of the recovering patient's mothers, Borgek realized, a woman whose daughter lay pale but breathing steadily on a pallet just inside, who broke the silence. "My girl was coughing blood 2 days ago," she said, voice shaking. "She's sleeping peaceful now for the first time in a week. I don't care what mark that man's got on his arm. I care that my girl's alive." Murmurs shifted through the crowd, uncertain, and Ashby seemed to find something in that shift to hold on to. He lowered his hand from his sword hilt. "The brand's a matter for the regional magistrate, not for a mob in a market square," he said, loud enough to carry, though his eyes stayed on Jeremiah weighing something. "Stone, finish the treatments, all of them, every soul in this town who needs it. Then you and I will discuss what's owed to the law and what's owed for what you've done here. That's the fairest I can offer, and it's more than most men in your position would get." "That's more than fair," Jeremiah said quietly. "Thank you, Captain." Borgek did not lower her guard until the crowd had fully dispersed, and even then she stayed close at his side as he returned to the sick room, her hand finding his once the door had closed behind them, gripping it hard enough to communicate everything she had no easy words for. "You didn't have to do that," Jeremiah said softly. "Stand in front of an entire square like that." "I told you once," Borgek said. "I am still adding to the debt, not paying it." "I do not think I will ever finish paying it, Jeremiah Stone, and I have stopped minding." He finished the treatments over the following 3 days, moving through every sickbed in Greywater with the same patient, gentle care. And by the week's end, the wasting fog had loosened its grip on the town entirely, no new cases, and every existing patient on the mend. Color returned to cheeks that had been gray as ash. The town's fear curdled slowly into something like shame, and then into grudging, complicated gratitude, the kind that did not erase suspicion overnight but at least made room for it to sit beside relief. The regional magistrate arrived on the 8th day, summoned by Ashby's own rider, an older woman named Lady Corwin who governed the northern coastal holdings from a keep 2 days inland, and had heard, by the time she reached Greywater, 3 different increasingly dramatic versions of what had transpired. She convened what passed for a hearing in the town square itself, before the assembled townsfolk, because Ashby had insisted rightly, Borgek thought, that a wrong done publicly deserved a reckoning done the same way. Jeremiah stood before the magistrate's makeshift bench with his sleeve rolled, the brand bare for all to see, and told his story plainly. The ceasefire, the wounded on both sides, Marin's teaching, the commander's punishment, 10 years of wandering with a mark that barred him from any settled practice. Lady Corwin listened without expression, and when he finished she turned to Ashby. "Captain, in your professional assessment, did this man's actions in Greywater constitute a service to the Crown's subjects, or a danger to them?" "A service, my lady," Ashby said, without hesitation now. "The greatest I've witnessed in 20 years wearing this coat. I'd stake my rank on it." and the original charge-treating enemy wounded under a truce flag. By the letter of the old garrison law, treason, Ashby admitted. By any decent reading of what a healer owes the wounded mercy. I wasn't there 10 years ago, my lady. I can't speak to what that commander saw or feared. I can only tell you what I saw this week, which was a branded man saving this whole town while an orc woman stood between him and a mob rather than see him harmed for it. Lady Corwin's gaze shifted to Borgak, standing at Jeremiah's side with her arms crossed and her chin high, daring anyone present to so much as suggest she did not belong there. "And you," the magistrate said. "You were the captive named in the Blackshell Cove report. You could have asked that merchant for gold enough to sail to the far side of the world and never think of this coast again. Instead, you asked for him." A pause, considering. "Why?" Borgak did not hesitate. "Because he saw me as a person before he saw me as an orc, a prize, or a debt to be paid," she said, her voice carrying clear across the hushed square. "Because he has spent every day since risking his own safety for people who fear him for a scar he earned showing mercy to my people during a war neither of us started. I would ask for him again, magistrate, 100 times over, and count myself fortunate every single time." A murmur ran through the crowd at that, not hostile this time, something closer to wonder. Lady Corwin was quiet for a long moment, studying them both. Then she rose from her bench, walked forward, and took Jeremiah's branded forearm in her own hand, turning it so the old scar caught the winter light for all to see. "By the authority granted me over these coastal holdings," she said, loud enough to carry to the furthest edges of the square, "I declare the charge against Jeremiah Stone, healer, formally overturned. Let the record show the original branding was a miscarriage of wartime justice, and let this mark stand henceforth not as a badge of shame, but as testament to a mercy this crown should have honored rather than punished. Jeremiah Stone is free to practice his art openly in this town or any other under my governance from this day forward." The square erupted, not into anger this time, but into something like cheering, ragged and disbelieving at first, and then swelling as the truth of it settled over the crowd. Ashby stepped forward and clasped Jeremiah's hand, something like an apology in the set of his shoulders, even though he offered none aloud. Somewhere in the crowd, the mother whose daughter had recovered was openly weeping with relief. Jeremiah stood in the middle of it all looking faintly dazed, as though 10 years of careful, hunted solitude had just been lifted off his shoulders all at once, and he did not yet know how to stand up straight without the weight of it. Borgak watched him for a moment, drinking in the sight of this quiet, gentle, stubborn man finally, publicly, undeniably vindicated in front of the very people who had, days before, called for his blood. And then she closed the distance between them without hesitation, cupped his face in both her broad hands and kissed him. Not carefully, not privately. Full in the middle of the Greywater town square, in front of Lady Corwin and Captain Ashby, and the mob that had nearly hanged him and the mother whose daughter he'd saved, and every last soul who had ever doubted that an orc woman and a human healer could belong to each other. She kissed him fiercely, defiantly, acclaiming as much as an affection, and did not care one bit who saw. The square went quiet for a heartbeat, and then someone, the recovering mother perhaps, or one of the watchmen, began to cheer, and the sound spread through the crowd like the fever had never touched them at all, until the whole square rang with it. Jeremiah, when she finally let him breathe, looked utterly thunderstruck, his face flushed, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears of relief or simply overwhelmed joy. "Well," he managed, a little unsteady, "I suppose that answers whether you meant to stay." "I told you in a sea cave I was not leaving," Borgak said, resting her forehead against his, heedless of the crowd still cheering around them. "Did you think a magistrate's hearing would change that?" "No," he admitted, laughing, disbelieving, alive with it. "No, I suppose I didn't." They stayed in Greywater through the rest of that winter, at Lady Corwin's own invitation, Jeremiah setting up the town's first proper healer's cottage near the harbor with funds the grateful town council scraped together without complaint, and Borgek at his side through all of it, not as a debt repaid, not any longer, but as something freely chosen and fiercely, unshakably held. She learned to grind herbs at his direction and argued constantly and cheerfully with him about the correct dosage for a fever tincture. He learned slowly to stop flinching when townsfolk stared at the two of them walking the harbor road together, learned instead to simply take her hand and let them stare. Old prejudices did not vanish overnight. There were still cold looks in the market some mornings, still an old fisherman or two who crossed the street rather than pass an orc woman on the harbor path. But Greywater had watched Borgek Ironblood stand between a mob and the man who'd saved their children, had watched her defend him with nothing to gain and everything to risk. And slowly, stubbornly, the town's suspicion softened into something like respect, and the respect in time into something like welcome. When spring came and the sea ice finally broke along the northern coast, Jeremiah Stone stood in the doorway of his new cottage, their cottage now, in every way that mattered, and watched Borgek sharpening a blade on the front step in the thin morning sun, utterly at ease in a life neither of them had planned for and both of them had come fiercely to love. "You know," he said, "when I cut those chains, I thought I was just doing what any decent person would do." "You were," Borgek agreed, not looking up from her whetstone. "I didn't expect to end up with a warrior wife who terrifies half the coast and argues with me about tincture ratios." "Wife," Borgek repeated, testing the human word in her mouth, and finally looked up at him, something warm and possessive and utterly certain in her green eyes. "Is that what I am to you, Jeremiah Stone?" "If you'll have me," he said, and there was no dry wit in it now, only plain, unguarded hope. "For as long as you'll stay." "I told a merchant in a cove full of smoke and chains that I named you as my price," Borgek said, setting down her blade and rising to close the distance between them, tall and strong and utterly unashamed of wanting him in front of the whole waking harbor town. I did not know then how small a word asterisk price was for what I actually meant. I meant you, Jeremiah Stone. All of you for all of it. That has not changed and it will not change, not for winter, not for mobs, not for anything this world thinks to throw at us. He kissed her then, in the doorway of the home they had built together out of a bargain neither of them had expected to become everything, with the harbor waking around them and the whole wide, healed coast stretched out beyond, and neither of them had ever, in all their separate lonely years before, felt so entirely and irrevocably found.